This podcast is brought to you by North Carolina's electric cooperatives.
This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Welcome. You've heard and read the spin the media and the politicians have put on the issues of the day. To get the correct spin on what's going on in North Carolina, let's introduce you to our panel of experts. They include Chris Fitzsimon, Director of NC Policy Watch, former State Board of Education and many other things, Phil Kirk, former Lieutenant Governor and many other things, Dennis Wicker, and syndicated columnist and author, John Hood. Well, on this show, we put our panels on the witness stand to testify about 3 lawsuits in the news. We'll quote scripture and verse on politics in the pulpit, especially William Barber's latest sermon. And after 20 years, we might be moving closer to delivering a sound basic education to our students. And of course, as always, we ask the panel to tell us something we don't know. We got a lot to discuss, so let's get started. On Thursday, the renewed challenge as to who controls public education in our state continued. Meanwhile, court battles over redistricting are back in court, with plaintiffs demanding the legislature draw new maps by August 11th and hold special elections. But who will oversee the election process? Another round in the dispute of the new law merging the State Board of Elections with the State Ethics Commission finds no members of the Board of Elections. Let's get our panel to talk about these particular lawsuits. I'll start with Phil Kirk. As former chair of the State Board of Education, what's your take on whether or not the legislature actually interfered with the constitutional powers of the State Board of Education?
I'll go way out on a limb and say this is extremely a complex issue and point out that we've had at least 3 lawsuits in the last 25, 30 years, 2 under the when everybody involved was Democrat, and now when everybody involved is basically Republican. I happen to see both sides of it. Number one, I believe in a strong CEO, and I believe the superintendent's elected and he ought to have authority. But then we have something like the Constitution that gets in the way. And the State Board, I think, has more, is mentioned more prominently in the Constitution than any other state board.
Very clearly.
And it's confusing. It's confusing. I think the court case is needed, but we've had several others. I just wish it would get resolved, however.
Dennis, the court said that the State Board has ultimate authority. But the judges said that the board didn't show in the lawsuit how this new law violated their powers, even though the legislature had taken away hiring authority and allocated funds to the superintendent. How do you respond to that?
Well, I tell you, I'm like Phil. It's a very tricky kind of question for everybody to deal with. And the truth of the matter is, Tom, it really points out to the chaotic way we have governance for our public schools in North Carolina. I mean, you got a State Board of Education, you got a Superintendent of Public Instruction, you got a County Board of Education, you got the legislature, you got the governor.
Yeah.
We've got to get
governor.
Yeah, I said the governor. So we've got to get some sanity to the governance side of this before I think we can really make strides in public schools in North Carolina.
Tom, the dispute, and I don't disagree with anything that Phil and Dennis said, but the dispute going into the case was often described as a dispute between the State Board of Education and the state superintendent. But what it actually ends up being, and what the 3-judge panel, I think, properly concluded, is the legislature matters. It's actually mentioned in the Constitution that the powers of the State Board of Education are subject to the laws passed by the General Assembly. The real question in front of the court is not who should run the public schools, but whether the legislature has the constitutional power to legislate in that area, and the judges said they did.
Chris, so what's going on now? I mean, we're sort of at a stalemate here in this thing, aren't we?
Well, we're going to go to the state Supreme Court. That's what's ultimately going to happen, and we're going to resolve this issue, I hope, once and for all. The question is, I don't disagree with John, the question is, what laws can the legislature make that usurps the power of the state board that's also specified in the state constitution? It is very complicated. I think the state Supreme Court's going to have to decide it.
Well, is there any possibility in doing it? As Phil says, we've had several lawsuits on this in recent years. What do we need here? Do we need to change the language in the Constitution and clarify it, or do we expect the Supreme Court to make a ruling on this?
Well, I think the logical solution has been and continues to be, if you're going to have an appointed state board of education, let them hire a superintendent instead of directly electing the superintendent. That makes a lot of sense. It's just not the system we have, and because we have this system and voters are loath to give up the power to elect, I think we're going to end up having to accommodate to some kind of elected executive plus a board that makes policy.
But we shouldn't stop there. That's part of it. We need to get a comprehensive plan on governance in our education system in North Carolina. We got 2 or 3 different factions that are making policy for education. It's chaotic.
Yeah.
And until we straighten that out, we're not going to get anywhere. I
want to move over to the redistricting fight. The courts have ruled that the legislators unconstitutionally drew legislative districts. The case went back to court over when those districts must be drawn and when legislative elections will be held. John, where do we stand on that?
The two sides are still making arguments about the practical implications, the burdens that are placed by either not holding a special election. The argument the plaintiffs are making is that means the legislature, populated in part by unconstitutional districts, is able to make policy they ought not to be making because the voters haven't really had their say in constitutional districts. But on the other hand, the state is arguing that most of the districts have not been struck down by the courts. Voters in good faith went and elected members to serve for 2 years. Why shouldn't they be able to serve out for the 2 years?
But it's over half the legislative districts are going to have to be redrawn.
No, not they're not court mandated to be redrawn. Only a minority of the districts, but the others will be affected when you redraw.
Chris, the legislature says they can have these new maps by November 15th, although many people think they've already got them. But the plaintiffs in the court say, no, we would like the maps drawn by August 15th and have primary elections in December with special new legislative elections on March 6th before the short session starts. What's your reaction to all these maneuvers?
Well, I think the courts are going to have to decide this. I do think it's a legitimate argument that General Assembly has known for quite a while these districts run constitutional. It is an odd thing to keep having laws made by a General Assembly that a significant number of which were elected unconstitutionally. It's the legislature themselves that say they're going to have to redraw more than 100 districts.
And that's exactly, Phil, what the plaintiffs are saying. They're saying that anything this legislature does or has done is unconstitutional because the representatives, many of the representatives, maybe not half, but many of the representatives were elected illegally.
I do understand why they're saying that, and I have trouble disagreeing with it. But from a practical standpoint, if that matters, we'd probably have a 10% turnout in December or March or whenever. And so we'd have new legislators being determined by a very small number of people.
All right,
we have too many elections now.
But let's play this thing out, Dennis, and assume we have elections in December. There's another problem. Court battles between Governor Cooper and the legislature over the merger of the State Board of Education, elections, and the Ethics Commission have everything on hold there. A 3-judge panel ruled that the legislature had the right to do this. So far, Governor Cooper hasn't made any appointments. What's going to happen if we do hold elections and there's nobody on the State Board of Elections?
I want to hear this.
No, look,
you're our lawyer.
Look, you see a wizard hat on my head? No. Look, I got to tell you, this is a very vexing problem. My guess is the court would order appointments be made in that same ruling in terms of when they set the date and those kinds of things that they'll be coming down with. This is a very uncharted waters for the judicial system, I think, Tom, and it's going to be really interesting to see it unfold.
We're in uncharted waters all over the whole state here, John. Maybe even more important to this is the fact that we've already had municipal filing periods open and close, and there are going to be a lot of municipal elections taking place this fall. What's the status of these local the county boards of elections?
Well, in some cases, they are populated with members who might be able to make decisions, and in other cases, not so clear. We got to hope that there's no controversy that is so significant that it has to be appealed to the State Board of Elections, which does not currently exist. This is a big mess, and it needs to be resolved as quickly as possible.
My understanding is if that takes place, then the contest automatically goes to the Court of Appeals. Is that correct?
That's right. So there's some place for it to go. It would be very clumsy. But you know that when the Governor Cooper obviously is appealing this, And the court said, don't appoint anybody, in effect. That was part of the Supreme Court's decision. So it's not like Cooper was dying to, didn't want to appoint anybody.
Neglecting his duty.
The court has, right, the court has said, don't appoint anybody until we resolve this.
Except they can request that the court, they bypass the Court of Appeals and go directly to the Supreme Court to expedite it.
Wow. Well, each week, many of you are signing up to receive our free weekly email newsletter, Spin Cycle, published each Friday morning. You'll get balanced opinion pieces from across the state, video footage not shown on the air, and my weekly column. It's easy to sign up. Just go to our website, ncspin.com, and do so. Get more balanced debate for the Old North State at ncspin.com, ncspin on YouTube, or on Twitter at ncspintweets. Politics from the pulpit. We're going to preach about that after these messages.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
In 2011, our farmers asked for 6,500 seasonal workers. Only 7 Americans showed up to work those jobs. Immigrant farm workers aren't stealing American jobs. To say otherwise ignores the facts. When farmers don't have enough skilled workers, crops go unharvested and farmers lose money. Consumers face fewer choices and higher prices. This is not acceptable. Tell Congress it's time to fix our broken immigration system.
The North Carolina General Assembly recently gave state retirees a well-deserved cost of living increase. Now local governments across North Carolina need to follow the legislature's lead and include retiree cost of living increases in their budgets. These increases are long overdue and desperately needed by all our retirees. The legislature heard us, and they did what's right. It's time for local governments to do the same. Learn more at ncrgea.com.
We now return to NC Spin.
The Johnson Amendment limited the amount of political involvement in which churches and nonprofits could engage, but a new provision being debated would make it virtually impossible for the IRS to enforce this provision. Dennis, I want to talk about that proposal, but while we're on the subject of religion and politics, Reverend William Barber, now, by the way, Bishop Barber, recently criticized pastors who prayed with President Trump, saying they were guilty of a form of theological malpractice bordering on heresy. Needless to say, these statements created quite a controversy, and I'd like your take on Barber's statements.
Religion and politics.
This is a softball question,
yeah, this
by the way.
is real softball for me. Religion and politics. That's thank you. Look, I think Bishop Barber went too far in what he said. But look, he's a fine and he's a decent man. He fiercely is advocated for the poor and the downtrodden, the meek, and throughout his lifetime he has served faithfully in the pulpit. But I think this is a symptom, Tom, of just how high emotions are running in the country. And so, you know, I believe that, and as someone who's a person of faith, I want to say to the viewers that we ought to pray for our president, whoever it is. And I would say that in this instance, I would never criticize anyone who would pray for President Trump.
Phil, that's the comment that many people have made, is that irrespective of his politics, we ought to always be praying for our president, our governor, elected officials, and so forth like that. Help us understand why Bishop Barber said this bordered on heresy. Do you understand that?
Well, I agree with what Dennis said, and I disagree with what Bishop Barber said. I think he has the flair for hyperbole. I think he's a very sincere individual. I think he knows how to get quoted in the media, and I think he went way too far. I was tempted to say that all presidents, particularly President Trump, needs our prayers. but I would apply that to every president. I prayed for, believe it or not, I prayed for President Obama. I think every president needs our prayers.
Yes,
and more.
I agree with that. John, originally the Johnson Amendment, which was sponsored by former President Lyndon Johnson when he was in the Senate, granted nonprofit status to organizations that wouldn't directly get involved in lobbying or political rhetoric. I guess the question is, has this Johnson Amendment outlived its usefulness, and does it need to be changed?
Well, there are two ways to respond to that. First of all, I think that it is still true, and it will always be true, that you should not have tax-exempt organizations that receive tax-deductible contributions engaging in direct partisan politics, endorsing candidates, campaigning for candidates. I think that's a bad idea. It has been a bad idea. Unfortunately, it has obviously been flouted for decades. Candidates go to churches, and they campaign in churches, and sometimes they even pass things around for money, and that still goes on today. It is to the extent that it is a problem, it is not a problem across the aisle. And so when Republicans complain about that and think that the rules ought to be lessened, you can understand their concerns about hypocrisy, but it's still a bad road to go on. We need to have a clean, firm line between a 501c3 organization like a church or a private college or whatever. They should not be engaged in partisan politics.
Chris, even though the lines are blurred a little bit here, I think the question is, should we remove the IRS tax-exempt status? They're 501c3s, and of course, political nonprofits and other nonprofits can participate in 501c4s.
Right.
So should we, why isn't this sufficient? Why do we need to do?
And 501c3s can actually lobby. They just can't participate in partisan politics. A lot of the lobbying groups in Raleigh are 501c3s, and the contributions are tax deductible. When you get into partisan politics, favoring one candidate or another, certainly endorsing a candidate, I think these rules do need to stay in place. Otherwise, you're having nonprofits who are in effect funded by the taxpayers, endorsing candidates. They're not paying local taxes, they're property taxes in most cases. They're not paying federal taxes. I think it's a very slippery slope. We need to leave the law as it is.
Dennis, if we chase this rabbit far enough down the hole, then we have to ask the question, is there no limitation for what churches and nonprofits can do so far as politics and advocacy and so forth like that? What do you think? Do the rights of free speech trump the politics from the pulpit?
Well, no, look, I'm a supporter of the Johnson Amendment. I think it's worked well through the years. I think for the most part, and I have to disagree with John just a little bit, I've campaigned in churches. I'm not campaigned in churches, but gone to churches during campaign season many, many times. I've never seen an abuse of it at all. I think churches, I think nonprofits pretty much adhere to the spirit of the law of the Johnson Amendment.
But would you agree, though, the lines have been, particularly in the recent years, have gotten very, very blurry along these lines?
They have. I mean, politicians go to churches or religious organizations that have property, and they clearly campaign. They absolutely flat out campaign.
They're asked to speak from the pulpit sometimes.
And that is what it is. Now, we can say, well, it's not quite the same as if the church issues a statement that says we endorse John Smith, and maybe we ought to just go ahead and go all the way to the yard, to the end zone and allow the issuance of those statements. I would rather go the other way and lean against religious institutions being the site of campaigning at all. Currently, it is clearly a site of campaigning.
Should that apply to other nonprofits, Chris?
Well, I think so. I think we need to be really careful when we're, and I think that has been abused too. But I do think for the most part, most of these organizations try to do the best they can. The last thing we need to do is weaken the law.
All right. After these messages, when we take a break, we're going to come back and talk about the sound basic education. Are we finally going to get there?
NC Spin will return after these messages.
The cost of everything has gone up dramatically over the last 75 years. With one exception, keeping electricity affordable. That's the power of your co-op membership. Learn more at togetherwesave.com.
North Carolina's Touchstone Energy Cooperatives, looking out for you.
I help educate and inspire visually impaired students to strive for a brighter future.
I make sure visitors to the North Carolina Zoo take a walk on the wild side.
And I make sure that the fuel you buy is a quality product from pipeline to pump.
I support small businesses in North Carolina by matching them with hard-working, well-trained employees.
I make sure the roads you drive on are safe.
Scenic, the one voice speaking in support of the men and women who are making North Carolina great.
You sleep on concrete till your body get immune to concrete.
My mom got my brother and I up and said, come on, we're leaving.
I became homeless in the beginning of this year.
When I was about 4 or 5 years old, our house caught fire.
I used to see my brother. If he see me, he'd turn and go the other direction.
We did the only thing that we could think of, and we went to a Salvation Army shelter.
You know, we don't have this, like, what's your background look like? We just say, what do you need?
I remember the man from the Salvation Army coming down with a box of clothes.
The Salvation Army officer bought my brother and I an ice cream cone.
Last week, my brother walked up to me, and he just started a conversation.
Today I've given my life to the Salvation Army because I remember what somebody did for me, my brother, and my mom over 30 years ago.
The Salvation Army for me means hope.
Compassion.
Family.
Support.
We now return to NC Spin.
20 years ago, the Supreme Court issued what's become known as the Leandro decision, stating that every child in our state is entitled to a sound basic education. But what does that mean? And how do we guarantee that's going to happen? The two sides in this lawsuit announced Monday that they have agreed to accept an independent consultant to suggest how to improve our state's public education. Chris, the announcement was somewhat vague as to who the consultant might be and how this was going to help. What are you hearing about this?
Well, I think a lot of people have different ideas about it. State Board Chairman Bill Cobey doesn't like the idea, says we don't need an independent consultant. The plaintiffs in the case, of people who think the state's not doing enough, don't like the idea. I'm not sure what's going to finally come of it, but we do sort of know what a sound basic education is. It's a qualified teacher in every classroom. It's basically a qualified principal running every school, and it's adequate resources to provide the kids the education they need. The best thing about Leandro is that we do have a definition. I would argue that we're still not meeting that in North Carolina. The question is, what do we do about it?
Yeah, John, the announcement said that this was going to be an independent, non-party consultant. And is supposed to be nominated by October 30th. What's your understanding of what this consultant is actually going to be empowered to do? Is he going to be able to propose legislation, direct funding, change policies, all of the above, or none?
Well, it's a consultant. Any proposal that would be offered by a consultant would have to actually be acted on by somebody who has authority, either a court issuing a court order or maybe the legislature or somebody instituting a policy. My admittedly idiosyncratic take on the entire Leandro case is very simple. It's a complicated case with lots of implications. But essentially, people went to court trying to force the state to spend more money on schools, even if it meant higher taxes.
Initially,
they're trying to get a court order
schools
to spend a certain amount of money, as has been happening in other states. They lost. The state has won the case on its fundamental claim since the very beginning. I am concerned this is the state surrendering and eventually endorsing some court-ordered increase in funding. That's what has always been the real point of Leandro, is a court order to spend more money and to raise taxes.
Dennis, you were right Phil, you were right in the middle of all of this when Leandro came down and been involved in this. Howdy Manning, the judge who presided over Leandro for many years, was sort of that independent, nonpartisan person we're talking about.
Right, and he's no longer doing that. So, but I'm mystified about the governor's role in this. He's just announced he's appointing a commission to determine what needs to be done. And I'd submit that we know what needs to be done. We just need the political will to do it. I think, I hate to agree with Chris too much, but I think he's right. We know what to do.
So we got to do it. We got the governor appointing this commission. We got an independent, nonpartisan consultant. We got the state. We just finished talking earlier in the show about the blurring lines of who's in charge of state public education. Dennis, does this help or hurt?
Both. Let me tell you. Query this, Tom. Who would qualify as a consultant for a one-time case that defines a constitution solely limited to North Carolina? How would they be qualified as a consultant to consult on any of that?
Well, I was getting ready to apply for that.
Exactly.
Plenty of consultants.
It's really going to be hard to explain to the constituents.
Just look for somebody with a briefcase, right?
Exactly.
All right, after these messages, we're going to ask the panel to tell us something we don't know.
NC Spin is brought to you in part by the North Carolina Farm Bureau. The Farm Bureau and Agriculture. We keep North Carolina growing.
The healthcare landscape is filled with questions and uncertainties of changes that are coming. In these times of change, there's one thing you can trust. You can trust your family physician to work for you, not only in treating sickness and disease, but also your overall health. Regardless of how healthcare might change, the men and women of the North Carolina Academy of Family Physicians pledge to work upholding your trust. Family Physicians, your trusted healthcare advisors.
I help educate and inspire visually impaired students to strive for a brighter future.
I make sure visitors to the North Carolina Zoo take a walk on the wild side.
And I make sure that the fuel you buy is a quality product from pipeline to pump.
I support small businesses in North Carolina by matching them with hard-working, well-trained employees.
I make sure the roads you drive on are safe.
Scenic, the one voice speaking in support of the men and women who are making North Carolina great.
We now return to NC Spin.
Now we come down to one of our favorite parts of the show when we ask the panel to tell us something we don't know. John Hood, I'll start with you.
Well, I'll start with something the viewers probably do know if they've been following business news, which is that Foxconn, an Apple supplier, having been courted by North Carolina and a number of other states, has announced a big $10 billion investment to many thousands of jobs in Wisconsin. However, that's not the complete end of the story. Foxconn is going to be making other investments over the next few months and years, and other suitors are still looking at the Rocky Mount related site and other sites in the state.
And in some instances, they've made announcements and haven't built the plants.
That happened in Pennsylvania,
yeah.
yes.
Dennis, tell us something we don't know.
We've been talking a lot about how we can enhance performance in our schools a great deal, Tom. Every morning when we wake up, 1/4 of our children are hungry. That translates into 53% of our school children go to school hungry. We can give them the finest principals we can find. We can find the most qualified teachers we can find and give them the state-of-the-art equipment, the brand new buildings. It ain't gonna help a bit if these children are hungry. They cannot learn.
If their bellies are growling.
That's it.
Phil Kirk, tell us something we don't know.
For the last several years, we've been moving away from paying teachers just based on how many years they've served and on their advanced degrees. Best NC, which is a pro-business education group, has secured over $10 million from the last two sessions of the legislature to set up a system of paying teachers based on additional duties, based on leadership, making them department heads, and trying to figure out ways to supplement their salaries. And they've got $10 million for pilot studies across the state.
I was getting ready to say, so it's going to be a pilot study.
There were five last year, and there'll be 10 to 15 more this year.
Chris Fitzsimon, tell us something we don't know.
Just over a month from now will be the 26th anniversary of the fire in Hamlet, North Carolina, where 25 people died behind locked fire doors at a chicken processing plant. There's a new book coming out the anniversary of the fire, September 3rd, about the fire, about what was happening in Hamlet, written by a guy named Bryant Simon, who got his PhD in history at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and now's at Temple. He'll be, I think, making the rounds to talk about this book. It really is an eye-opener about worker safety, poverty, low-wage jobs, and I hope people will pick it up.
Harry Payne was the Commissioner of Labor.
Harry Payne became the Commissioner of Labor after the fire because a lot of people thought the Department of Labor wasn't doing what it's supposed to be doing.
Well, you've heard our spin on the issues of the day. To stay informed all during the week, give your feedback, and read my weekly column, be sure to visit our website, ncspin.com, or catch NC Spin on Facebook. And join us next week when we'll have more balanced debate for the Old North State. Until then, stay informed and watch out for the spin.
Join us next week and get the spin on issues facing our state.